The champagne glass slipped from my hand at the exact moment my son's words, Christopher's words, cut through that luxurious room like a cold blade. "My mother is unemployed." He said it with a tone so indifferent, so casually dismissive, that it stung more than any raised voice ever could. Sarah Lynn, his new wife, tilted her head slightly, wearing that perfectly polished high society smile, and delivered the killing blow. Perhaps permanently. The laughter that followed wasn't friendly. It was the kind of sound only the wealthy possess, that icy, careless amusement of people who treat poverty like a harmless spectacle. I am Angela Price, 54 years old, and at that moment, sitting at a polished mahogany table surrounded by the Lynn family in their Potomac, Maryland mansion, I truly believed I had heard every kind of insult imaginable. I was wrong. Around me were crystal glasses, candlelight flickering on silk gowns, and faces accustomed to measuring human worth by the numbers in a bank account. But none of them knew. Just 6 hours earlier, my entire life had changed. And that was the only reason I didn't burst out laughing. I glanced around the vast dining room. The art pieces hung meticulously on the walls. In my mind, I drifted back to my tiny 2-bedroom apartment in Eastern Market, Capitol Hill, where I had raised Christopher alone after my husband died of lung cancer when our son was only 12. I remembered the long night shifts at the hospital, coming home under dim lights, still cooking so he'd have breakfast before school. I remembered the tear-soaked hug from that little boy years ago. "Mom, I'll take care of you when I grow up. I promise." But that boy was long gone. Now, seated in front of me was a 32-year-old man raising his wine glass, chatting with his father-in-law about promising investment opportunities, while his own mother was treated like an inconvenient servant who had wandered into their elegant dinner. What field was Angela in again? Daphne Lynn, Sarah's mother, asked in a tone suggesting she was trying to pinpoint just how far down the social ladder customer service might fall. "I was a manager at Hartwell Communications," I answered softly, though the word was throbbed painfully in my chest. 22 years there, now reduced to nothing. "Didn't Hartwell go bankrupt last month?" Reginald Lynn chimed in, with a performance of fake sympathy. "Such a shame for those who lost their jobs." Then the conversation quickly shifted to familiar upper-class topics: summer trips to the Hamptons, the new yacht they were considering buying, their plans for redecorating the guest house. I kept smiling, nodding, playing the role of the agreeable mother-in-law. But in my mind, I was replaying the phone call from that morning. "Mrs. Price, this is James Morrison from Morrison Stewart and Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Ms. Helena Price. There is an important development we need to discuss urgently." Aunt Helena, my father's eccentric younger sister, who had moved to Switzerland 40 years ago and nearly cut off all contact. My family always assumed she lived like a bohemian artist, selling a few paintings to tourists just to get by. "I regret to inform you that Ms. Helena Price passed away 3 weeks ago in Geneva. However, I'm pleased to tell you that you are the sole beneficiary named in her will." I assumed it would be a few $1,000s, maybe some old keepsakes. But then James Morrison said the sentence that flipped my world upside down. "The estate is valued at approximately $47 million, Mrs. Price. It appears your aunt was quite successful in her investments." $47 million. I spent the entire morning sitting in Morrison's office, signing documents, trying to comprehend the situation. By noon, I had more money than I had ever dared dream of. And then, at 6 in the evening, I found myself at this dinner, listening to my daughter-in-law mock my unemployment, while her father bragged about acquiring struggling companies at bargain prices. "The most important thing," Reginald lectured Christopher as they enjoyed dessert, "is finding companies in trouble but with valuable assets. Buy cheap, cut unnecessary costs, usually older employees, then restructure to boost profits." "That sounds amazing," Christopher said. eyes shining as if learning some secret formula for success. I watched the two men, realizing I was witnessing a live masterclass in corporate cruelty, a world where human suffering was merely a line item to be eliminated, but I also saw an opportunity. "What kind of companies do you usually target?" I asked, keeping my voice light. Reginald brightened instantly. "Media companies are perfect targets, or outdated tech firms, family-owned factories with no capital to modernize. Those owners are often desperate to sell before they lose everything." "Fascinating," I murmured, storing every word. The evening ended with air kisses and the usual empty promises. We must do this again soon. Christopher and Sarah drove me back to my little Capitol Hill apartment, chatting the whole way about their upcoming wedding and honeymoon. "They're considering Tuscany," Sarah said excitedly. "Of course it's a bit pricey." "Maybe you could help cover part of the cost," Christopher added. "I mean, once you find another job." I watched their BMW disappear down the street. Then I climbed the stairs slowly, turned on the light in my small apartment, and took out the business card James Morrison had handed me that morning. On the back was a handwritten note. "Contact Amira Patel, Mergers and Acquisitions Specialist, private and confidential. 11 p.m., but some calls cannot wait until morning. This is Amira Patel speaking. Ms. Patel, this is Angela Price. James Morrison gave me your number. I want to initiate an acquisition. Quickly and with absolute discretion." "What kind of acquisition, Mrs. Price?" I looked at the framed photo on my mantel. Christopher at his law school graduation, his arm around me, both of us smiling. Smiles from a time when I believed love and gratitude could never fade, but that young man no longer existed. Standing in his place now was someone who treated his mother's downfall as a punchline. I took a deep breath. "I want to acquire Lynn Global Advisors," I said. "All of it." There was a silence on the other end. Then Amira spoke, her voice barely steady. "Mrs. Price, that is a $40 million company." "I know," I said slowly. "Is there a problem?" In Washington, D.C., where power is measured by handshakes behind closed doors, an unemployed mother was about to teach the financial elite a lesson they would never forget. And in the next chapter, we'll see how Angela Price begins her revenge, not with tears, but with the law, intelligence, and a plan so intricate it chills the spine. The next morning, I woke up with a hazy feeling, wondering if everything that happened yesterday had been nothing more than a bizarre dream. Then I opened my phone, looked at my bank account, where 8 digits glowed back at me, and reality hit, heavy and brilliant, like a freight train carrying $47 million worth of possibility. But before I tell you about the acquisition strategy, I need to tell you about Aunt Helena. I last saw her when I was 14. That day, she had come back to the U.S. from Geneva for a short visit. Her silver hair was tied up high, her bright eyes glowing as if she knew a secret the world hadn't learned yet. I still remember her sitting in my father's kitchen, sipping red wine, laughing as she talked about her life in Switzerland. "Angela," she said, placing her hand over mine, her voice as gentle as a breeze, "never let anyone make you believe you're not enough. The men in this family, including my own brother, always think women are supposed to be small, obedient, and grateful. But you know something? I left. I chose freedom and built a life no one could ever take back." I remember asking her, "But weren't you lonely?" She laughed, a laugh tinged with sadness, but still radiant. "My dear, it's better to be lonely and free than loved and imprisoned." At the time, I didn't understand, but many years later, when my husband, Michael Price, passed away, leaving me with a 12-year-old child and a mountain of medical debt, I began to understand every single word. Michael was a good man, a high school history teacher who loved his work more than money. But when lung cancer hit, insurance wasn't enough. I had to work 3 jobs just to stay afloat. Morning shift, waitress at the restaurant near the hospital. Afternoon shift, receptionist at Hartwell Communications. Night shift, office cleaning. Christopher, my son, never missed a meal, never lacked a book to read. He had no idea that some nights his mother slept only 3 hours before starting the cycle all over again. I remember the night Michael died, as vividly as if it were yesterday. Christopher climbed onto the hospital bed, hugging his father tightly, crying uncontrollably. When the doctor pronounced him dead, my son turned to me, face pale, voice trembling. "Mom, what are we going to do now?" I held him close, my tears not yet falling. "We're going to live for your father." And we truly lived. I was promoted at Hartwell, from receptionist to client relations manager. Christopher earned a scholarship to Georgetown Law Life, seemed to finally be moving in the right direction. But you know, life always finds a way to test how strong you really are, right when you think you're finally safe. Sometimes it's not loss that hurts the most. It's when the person you love most begins to look at you like a stranger. For me, that moment began with the name Sarah Lynn. Christopher met Sarah at a charity event 8 months ago. The first time he brought her home, I knew. The way Sarah looked around my little apartment, not with disdain, but with pity. The way one observes a rare animal in a zoo, curious, sympathetic, yet still standing safely behind the fence. "Your apartment is very cozy," she said, her voice sweet to the point of artificial. "I've lived here 15 years, I replied proudly. "This is where Christopher grew up." "Yes, he told me," she smiled. "It's touching." I wasn't a difficult mother-in-law. I tried to blend in, invited them over for dinner, cooked the dishes Christopher loved as a child. I asked about Sarah's job at her father's company. I kept smiling even when Daphne Lynn, Sarah's mother, accidentally mentioned that her daughter could have married a senator's son. I thought I had grown used to those silk-wrapped insults, but then came last night's dinner, the dinner that transformed me from a proud mother into the unemployed mother-in-law in the eyes of everyone at that table. And in that moment, I understood. In their world, Angela Price was not the woman who raised a child alone, who worked 3 jobs to survive, who kept her dignity whole despite poverty. I was just an inconvenient wrinkle in their perfect family portrait. But there was one thing they didn't know. They didn't know about Aunt Helena. They didn't know she once said, "Never let anyone make you small. You were born to shine." And they certainly didn't know that in her will there was a letter written just for me. "My dear Angela, if you are reading this, it means I'm gone. I leave this fortune to you not because you need it, but because I trust you will use it wisely. I have seen in you what our family never did, the quiet strength of a woman who knows how to wait for the right moment. Never let anyone make you small. You were born to shine." That letter sat in a sealed envelope alongside the will, and when I finished reading it, my hands were still trembling. My whole life, I had lived to keep things from falling apart, but for the first time, I thought, maybe it's time to rebuild, but on my own terms. Now, in my small Capitol Hill apartment with $47 million in my account, I could see Aunt Helena's face in my memory, her eyes glowing in that old kitchen as if she were nodding at me. It was time to shine. In the next part, I'll tell you about the first move, how a woman who seemed cast aside managed to use an inherited fortune to shift the power board in Washington, D.C. And trust me, you won't believe who the first person Angela Price acquires actually is. Amira Patel was younger than I expected, around 40, with sleek, sharp black hair and eyes so focused they made me feel as though she ate mediocre lawyers for breakfast. Her office in Rosslyn, Arlington, was an open-glass space overlooking the Potomac River and the Capitol, the kind of office that screamed expensive competence. "Mrs. Price," Amira began as we sat across from each other at a modern desk, "I have to ask, what is your relationship to Lynn Global Advisors?" I told her everything, about Christopher and Sarah, about the dinner, about Reginald Lynn's effortless cruelty toward people like me, about the way they laughed as if hardship were a harmless joke. Amira's expression shifted from professional concern to something almost predatory. "So this is personal," she concluded. "Very personal," I confirmed. "But I want to do it legally and thoroughly. No shortcuts, no shady tricks. When it ends, I want Reginald Lynn to know exactly who destroyed his empire and why." Amira smiled for the first time since meeting me. "Mrs. Price, I think you and I are going to work very well together." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Lynn Global Advisors was profitable but cash poor, overextended from recent acquisitions. They were funding themselves through a complex web of loans and credit agreements, impressive on paper, but in reality, extremely fragile. "We don't need to buy the entire company," Amira said, spreading documents across the table. "We just need to control enough of their debt to force a sale." "How much do they owe?" $34 million to 17 different entities, and the largest creditor, an investment group tied to pension funds, is nervous about irregularities in Lynn's portfolio. "How nervous?" "Nervous enough to sell us their debt position at 60 cents on the dollar, especially if we provide evidence that Lynn may be unable to pay. And if we own their debt, we become their largest creditor, and if they can't pay, which they won't once we call certain loans, we can push them into bankruptcy or force a distressed sale." It was delicious. Reginald Lynn had built his fortune on financial manipulation, and now those very tactics would be the thing that drowned him. But the sweetest part was this. I wouldn't just destroy his company. I would buy it. How long will it take? 2 weeks if everything goes smoothly. Faster if they panic. I thought about Sarah's wedding dress, still hanging in her childhood bedroom, waiting for a June ceremony that now had an entirely different meaning. I thought about Christopher, who had quietly begun planning how to spend his wife's family money, money that would soon no longer exist. "Do it," I said. Amira was dialing her phone before I even stood to leave the office. That night, the city slept while I stayed awake. There are battles you fight for justice, but you must walk through your family to reach the truth. If I backed down, I would betray myself and the 200 people at Hartwell. If I moved forward, I might lose my son. But a mother doesn't just give birth. She teaches her child how to walk straight when the world wants them to bend. Alone in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, the old wooden one Michael and I bought at a thrift store in our first year of marriage, wondering, am I doing the right thing? Christopher is my son, my blood. The child I held tight the night Michael died, silently promising I would never let him be alone. And now I was about to destroy his wife's family, forcing him to choose between them, and possibly against me. I opened the drawer and pulled out the box of letters Michael wrote during the last 6 months of his life. When he knew he wouldn't make it, I took out one letter and immediately recognized his familiar handwriting. "My dear Angela, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. What worries me isn't dying, but leaving you alone to face the world. But I know you're strong, stronger than you think, stronger than anyone I've ever known. Teach Christopher this. Justice doesn't happen by itself. It's something we must fight for. And sometimes, fighting means standing up to those who have power. Never let anyone, not even our son, make you feel small. I love you. Always, Michael." I folded the letter, tears falling silently. What would Michael do? He would fight. Not for revenge, but for justice. For the 200 people at Hartwell, for the Thompson family. For everyone Reginald Lynn had ground under his heel. And he would teach our son the same lesson, that the useless mother he dismissed might be stronger than anyone imagined. I wiped my tears, closed the box, and opened my laptop. It was time to do my homework. All Sunday night, I dug through Lynn Global Advisors. It wasn't hard. Reginald Lynn was arrogant enough to leave trails everywhere. The company specialized in buying distressed businesses, but the dark side of the model was simple. Target suffocating family companies, offer a lifeline, then systematize the removal of their assets piece by piece. Thompson Manufacturing, 60 years old, was wiped clean after Lynn stripped the assets and sold the real estate to developers. Hartwell Communications, my old company, had been hollowed so deeply that 200 employees lost their jobs right before Christmas. But Reginald had made a fatal mistake. He bragged at the dinner. 3 of his last 5 acquisitions were companies I could prove had been systematically undervalued through questionable accounting practices. More importantly, 2 of them involved pension funds that disappeared during the buyout process. By Monday morning, I had enough to bury Reginald in litigation for a decade, but I wanted something far more elegant. 2 days later, Amira and her team were machines. By Thursday, we owned 38% of Lynn Global Advisors' debt. By Friday, we acquired controlling positions in 2 of their subsidiaries. And on Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after Reginald humiliated me at his dinner table, I got the call I had been waiting for. "Mrs. Price, this is Reginald Lynn. I think we need to talk." I was making coffee in my modest apartment when the man who mocked my unemployment now called to beg. The irony was so perfect, I almost laughed. "Of course, Reginald. How can I help you?" "I think you know what this is about. Your people have been very aggressive in the market this week." "My people?" I stirred honey into my cup, looking out at the quiet suburban street I had lived on for 5 years. Next week, I could buy any house in the city, but right now I was exactly where I wanted to be. "Don't play games, Angela. I know what you're doing. The question is what you want." "What I want, Reginald, is to meet you tomorrow morning, your office, 9 a.m., and come alone." "Angela, do you think you're—" "9 a.m., I repeated, then hung up. The rest of Saturday, I rehearsed every word I would say to the man who had treated me like garbage while destroying the livelihoods of hundreds like me. But before that, I needed to make a call. "Christopher, it's Mom. I hope I'm not interrupting your Saturday." "Hi, Mom. Not at all. We're having brunch with Sarah's parents. Actually, her dad's been really stressed this week. Must be business stuff." "I'm sure it's nothing serious," I said, trying to hide the satisfaction in my voice. "Listen, sweetheart, come over for dinner tomorrow night, you and Sarah. There's something I need to talk to both of you about." "Sure. Is everything okay? You sound different." "I'm fine, sweetheart, more than fine. See you tomorrow at 7. Hanging up, I sat in my living room, surrounded by discount store furniture, and thought about the conversation I would have with my son in 24 hours. Christopher was about to learn a lesson: respect, consequences, and the danger of underestimating the mother he thought was worthless. But first, I needed to finish dismantling his father-in-law's empire. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of October day that makes you believe anything can start over. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Reginald Lynn, the simple black suit I used to wear to job interviews, and my grandmother's old pearl earrings. Nothing flashy. Nothing that suggested there were $47 million sitting in my bank account. Lynn Global Advisors occupied 3 full floors of a glittering glass tower at 1700 K Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. The kind of building where marble floors and brass railings exist purely to remind everyone of the power of the people inside. I had driven past it dozens of times during my Hartwell Communications years, but I had never once stepped inside. Until today. The receptionist looked slightly confused when she heard my name. "Mr. Lynn is expecting me," I said, with the quiet confidence of someone holding all the cards. Reginald Lynn's office was exactly what I imagined. Mahogany wood, black leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the city. He stood with his back to me, watching the skyline, looking like a man contemplating the end of his own story. 40 years, he said, not turning around. "I built this firm from nothing. 3 employees, 1 borrowed desk, back in 1984. "Impressive," I replied, sitting down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited. "Although you skipped the part where you destroyed 200 families along the way." He finally turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw something in Reginald Lynn I had never seen before. Fear, bone deep, fear. The fear of a man about to lose everything he spent his life hoarding. "What do you want, Angela?" "Accountability," I said slowly, "and justice for people like me." He moved behind his desk, shuffling papers, his hand trembling slightly. "I can offer a settlement. Enough to make all this go away." "How much?" $5 million in cash, untraceable. I pretended to consider it, watching the tiny flicker of hope spark in his eyes. "That's a generous offer, Reginald, but I'm afraid I don't accept bribes." He narrowed his eyes. "Then what do you want?" I leaned forward, looking directly into his eyes. "I want you to sell the company to me." The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, the city buzzed with the usual Sunday morning traffic, while inside, Reginald Lynn's world was collapsing by the minute. "Impossible," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "This firm is worth $40 million. "Actually," I replied, "as of the end of last week, it's down to $12 million, thanks to some new information about irregularities in your pension funds. But I'm generous. $15 million in cash for everything." "The firm is not for sale." I smiled, the same polite smile I had worn all through Thursday night's dinner. "Oh, Reginald, I think you misunderstand. This isn't a negotiation." I opened my bag and pulled out a thick folder Amira Patel had prepared, legal documents, statements, audit reports, enough to choke an empire. "Right now, you owe $34 million to 17 different creditors. And as of Friday afternoon, I own 87% of that, which means I can call in the debt anytime I like." His face went pale. "You can't do that." "Actually, I can. Your credit agreements have a very interesting clause. If there is a significant change in business conditions, the entire loan can be accelerated immediately, and I imagine a federal investigation counts as a significant change, don't you?" "What federal investigation?" I pulled out another sheet, this one bearing the letterhead of the Department of Labor, the one that begins tomorrow morning when they receive a detailed file on your questionable accounting practices. Of course, if you sell the company before that news becomes public, things might be more pleasant. He collapsed into his chair, shoulders sagging. For 40 years, Reginald Lynn had been a predator, circling weakened companies like a shark smelling blood. Now he knew exactly what it felt like to be the prey. "You're destroying me," he said, his voice raw. "No, Reginald, I'm just making you answer for what you've done. There's a difference." Up there on that high floor, sunlight poured through the glass, landing full on his face, the face of a man who once believed himself untouchable. And in that moment, I realized something. The world hadn't changed. Only the direction of power had. I wasn't taking revenge. I was simply returning the pain to its rightful owner. 3 hours later, the negotiations were over. Amira Patel handled the legal terms while I sat silently, watching Reginald sign page after page, surrendering 40 years of his life, with the same empty stare I had seen in the business owners he had shattered. By 2 p.m, I owned Lynn Global Advisors. All 43 subsidiaries, all assets, all liabilities, and every ounce of power that came with them. And I owned something else, the pure satisfaction of watching Reginald walk out of his own building carrying nothing but a briefcase and a bitter truth. His son-in-law's unemployed mother-in-law had just become his new boss. Well, former boss. Because my first decision would be to fire him. But before he left, I needed one more signature. "Reginald," I called as he was fastening his coat. "One more small thing." He turned back, exhausted and defeated. "What do you want now? My blood?" "No," I said, sliding another document across the desk. "I want you to sign this undertaking. You will fully cooperate with me in identifying and contacting every family affected by your firm's activities. You will provide complete records, every acquisition, every pension fund, every employee who was laid off. And if I refuse, I will send a full copy of your financial records, including that offshore account in the Cayman Islands you thought no one knew about, straight to the FBI tomorrow morning." Reginald stared at me for a long moment, and in his eyes there was something almost like respect. "You planned all of this, didn't you?" "Not all of it," I replied with a small smile. "But on Thursday night, when you bragged about bankrupting family-owned companies for profit, I knew exactly what I was going to do." He picked up the pen. His hand still shook, but he signed. That afternoon, I sat alone in the office that now belonged to me, looking out through the massive window as sunlight stretched across the buildings of D.C. On the desk lay the files of Lynn Global Advisors, evidence of decades of greed and deceit. The companies Lynn had destroyed could be restored, the pension funds could be repaid, the families he had crushed could be compensated. But first, I had a dinner to attend, and a son who needed to learn the most important lesson of his life. Christopher and Sarah arrived exactly at 7. Sarah brought a bottle of wine that was probably more expensive than my entire monthly grocery budget. She was dressed down for the occasion. Designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, the kind of outfit meant to signal she was connecting with regular people. "You look great, Mom," Christopher said, kissing my cheek, rested. "I am great," I replied. "In fact, I feel fantastic. Sit down, both of you. Can I get you something to drink?" "Wine would be wonderful," Sarah answered, her eyes scanning my modest living room with the polite smile people wear when visiting an elderly relative in assisted living. I poured 3 glasses of the wine she brought, checking the label, a roughly $200 bottle from Reginald's private collection. How thoughtful. He had unknowingly contributed the wine for his own funeral. "So," Christopher said as he sat on the sofa, Sarah sliding in beside him. "You said you had news?" "I do," I nodded. "About my employment situation." Sarah brightened instantly, relief obvious. "Oh, that's wonderful. Did you find another customer service position?" "Actually, I've transitioned into the mergers and acquisitions sector." "Mergers and acquisitions?" Christopher frowned. "Mom, that's a highly specialized field. Doesn't that require deep financial experience?" "You would think so," I smiled, "but it turns out I have more transferable skills than anyone expected." "What kind of M&A?" Sarah asked, indulging what she clearly believed was her mother-in-law's midlife fantasy. "Well, just this morning, I acquired an investment firm downtown 43 companies. Technically, I'll be managing them as subsidiaries." Christopher laughed, the patient kind of laugh people use when elderly relatives announce they want to become astronauts. "That's great, Mom. You mean you got an entry-level position? Maybe administrative support?" "No, sweetheart. I own the company, all of it." The silence that followed was thick. Sarah's wine glass halted halfway to her lips. Christopher's smile froze like a paused video frame. "I'm sorry," Sarah said slowly. "I think I misheard. You said you own a company?" "Lynn Global Advisors," I said clearly. "I bought it this morning. Cash transaction." Sarah's wine glass slipped from her fingers, leaving a red splash on the beige carpet. It looked disturbingly like blood. She stared at me as though I had sprouted a second head. "That's impossible." Christopher shook his head. "Mom, Lynn Global Advisors is worth millions. 40 million to be exact, though I acquired it for significantly less." "Mom," Christopher's tone shifted into the patient cadence people use when an older relative is confused. "I think you misunderstood. Maybe someone offered you a job there? Or—" I reached into my bag and pulled out the contract Amira Patel had prepared, bearing my signature and Reginald Lynn's defeated scrawl. "Would you like to see the paperwork?" Christopher took it, his hands trembling. Sarah read over his shoulder. I watched their faces change as the numbers and legal language hammered the truth into them. Christopher's unemployed mother had just bought his father-in-law's empire. "Where did you get the money?" Sarah whispered. Inheritance, I said cheerfully. Turns out Aunt Helena was quite successful in Switzerland, $47 million of successful, to be precise. The room was so quiet, I could hear the kitchen clock ticking. Christopher kept staring at the contract, as though sheer willpower could rearrange the words into something more comfortable. So, Sarah said carefully, you're telling us you've been secretly wealthy all this time? Not all this time, only since Thursday morning. Thursday, Sarah repeated, right before our dinner party. Yes, fascinating timing, isn't it? I saw it, the flicker in Sarah's eyes as the realization hit her, followed by pure horror. She was remembering Thursday night, her mother's demeaning question, her own casual cruelty about my job prospects. Oh my God, she breathed. My father is going to kill me. But Christopher was still doing math in his head. Mom, does this mean you're... He stopped. Rich beyond all wild dreams? I offered. Yes, sweetheart, although frankly, my dreams have gotten much wilder recently. I took a sip of Reginald's wine and smiled at the two people who, 4 days earlier, had treated my poverty like a new punchline. Now then, I continued, let's talk about your wedding plans. The conversation that followed felt like watching two people realize they'd been swimming with a shark while wearing raw meat suits. Christopher kept looking between the contract and my face. Sarah was pale enough to audition for a vampire film. I don't get it, Christopher finally said. If you inherited money Thursday, why didn't you tell us? When exactly did you want me to mention it? During the charming discussion about my unemployment? Or when your wife suggested my job prospects were hopeless? Sarah jerked back as if slapped. Mrs. Price, I'm sorry, if I had known. If you had known I was rich, you would have respected me, I cut in. Interesting. So courtesy is a privilege that can be purchased. Good to know. That's not what I meant, Sarah stammered. You mean poor people deserve mockery and rich people deserve politeness. Christopher set the contract down and rubbed his face with both hands. Mom, this is insane. You bought Sarah's father's company. His life's work. His life's work was built on destroying families like ours. Yes, sweetheart. I like to call it a hostile takeover with an extremely personal motive. Personal motive? Sarah's voice cracked. What do you mean? I lifted the bottle, Reginald's bottle, which made everything taste sweeter, and poured more wine. Let's see. Your father spent Thursday night explaining his business model. Buy struggling companies, then strip them piece by piece. He proudly talked about cutting unnecessary costs, meaning firing anyone over 50. My father is a businessman, Sarah whispered. He had to make hard decisions. Hard decisions like tapping into Hartwell Communications' pension fund? My old company. 200 people lost their jobs before Christmas, so your father could boost margins. Pension fund? Christopher said, confused. What are you talking about? I pulled out another folder. The evidence Amira Patel had compiled on the questionable accounting practices at Lynn Global Advisors. Would you like to read it? It's riveting if you enjoy white-collar crime thrillers. Sarah was shaking now, truly shaking, as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. You can't prove anything, she insisted weakly. My father is legal in everything he does. Legal and ethical are not the same, and I'm afraid some of these irregularities drift into dangerous legal territory. You're threatening my father? Christopher said, his tone strange. Threatening? No, sweetheart. I'm explaining why I had no choice but to remove him from power. Men like Reginald Lynn destroy lives because they can. Now he can't. Christopher shot up, walked to the window, then turned back. Mom, do you realize what you've done? You just destroyed Sarah's family. Her father's entire identity is tied to that company. And my identity used to be tied to being your mother, until you decided I was an embarrassment. The words hung in the air like a blade. Christopher froze. Confusion, hurt, anger, and finally shame flickered across his face. I never said you were an embarrassment. You didn't need to. Your actions said everything. Sarah was crying, quietly, but still trying to salvage something. Mrs. Price, please. Thursday night we handled things badly, but surely there's some arrangement. What arrangement? You could sell the company back to my father for what you paid. With interest. Call it a misunderstanding. I set my glass down and looked directly at Sarah Lynn, soon to be Walsh. 28, beautiful, privileged, and genuinely convinced that her family's money made her untouchable. Perhaps she had never faced a real consequence in her life. Sarah, do you know the Thompsons? Sarah shook her head. Thompson Manufacturing belonged to them for 60 years, 3 generations of honest work, providing jobs for half their town. When the economy dipped, they went to Lynn Global Advisors for help. Your father bought the company, stripped the assets, and sold the factory to a developer. 60 years of legacy became a parking lot. Business is business, Sarah whispered, but her voice was unsteady. Business is people. The Thompsons lost everything. Their home, their savings, their reputation. Mrs. Thompson had a heart attack 3 months after the sale. She's 73 and now stands in grocery store lines because her pension was gutted. Christopher said nothing for a long time. Staring at his hands, Sarah's tears shifted from panic to genuine sorrow. "What do you want from us?" Christopher finally asked. The very question I had waited 3 days to answer. I want you both to understand. Actions have consequences. I want you to learn that cruelty, especially toward people you believe don't matter, comes back in ways you can't imagine. And after that? Sarah wiped her tears, mascara streaking her face, making her look younger and more fragile. And after that, if possible, we move forward as a family. What about my father? Sarah whispered. He's learning what helplessness feels like. An educational experience I strongly encourage. Mom, Christopher asked quietly, what are you planning to do with the company? Finally, the right question. I smiled, remembering my conversations with Amira Patel about restructuring and a restitution fund. I'm going to fix it. Every company your father-in-law broke apart, every family he pushed over the edge, every pension he tampered with, I'm going to restore it. Lynn Global Advisors will become what it should have been from the beginning, a firm that builds, not destroys. That'll cost millions, Christopher said softly, 47 million to be exact. Amazing what you can do when greed isn't your guiding principle. I got up and went to the kitchen, returning with another bottle of wine, from the modest collection I'd bought back when I worked in customer service. Now, I said, refilling their glasses, let's talk about your wedding plans. I imagine you'll need to adjust your budget quite a bit. The warm, yellow light of my little apartment fell across the thick contract on the table. The red wine stain on the carpet looked like a marker dividing eras. On one side was habit, the unemployed mother who let insults roll off her. On the other side was truth, the woman who now held the power to decide outcomes. The question was no longer, how much money does Mom have? But rather, what will she do with the power she now holds? And the answer was just beginning. Sarah and Christopher exchanged a look. One glance was enough to say everything. The dream wedding at the Lynn estate, the no-cap budget, the elite guest list, had all evaporated along with Reginald's empire. We could do something smaller, Sarah whispered. Something simple. Ridiculous, I replied crisply. You're marrying my son. Your wedding should be exactly what you want it to be. They stared at me as though I'd just spoken ancient Greek. I don't understand, Christopher exhaled. I'm offering to pay for your wedding, sweetheart. Any kind of ceremony that will make you both happy. Silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. They could have the wedding of their dreams, but the person footing the bill was the woman they had mocked, and the organizer would be the woman who had just toppled Sarah's father's legacy. Why would you do that? Sarah whispered. I looked at my son, truly looked at him, for the first time since he'd announced his engagement. Despite everything that had happened, despite the cruelty and humiliation, he was still the little boy who once ran to me with scraped knees and nightmares. Because I love Christopher, and I want him to be happy, even when he makes mistakes. Christopher's eyes glistened. "Mom, I'm sorry about Thursday night, about everything we said." "I know you're sorry, sweetheart. Do you forgive us?" I weighed the question, even as I noticed Sarah struggling to adjust to the reality. Her future mother-in-law was offering to pay for a wedding her biological father could no longer afford. "Forgiveness isn't automatic, Christopher, but it's possible. What do you think you need to do?" This was the moment I had prepared for since Thursday night, the chance to teach my son and his fiancée that respect cannot be bargained for, kindness always has value, and sometimes the person you underestimated is the one you should fear most. "We start," I said, "with honest conversations about how this family will operate from now on." "And Sarah?" Christopher asked. Sarah lifted her gaze, eyes red. "Tomorrow morning, you call your father and tell him that you and Christopher want to have dinner with him in a public place. I have a few things I'd like to say to him directly." Pure horror flashed across Sarah's face. Almost worth $47 million. Almost. The warm light of my small apartment locked the three of us into the same shared tableau. A proposal that looked like salvation, an invisible debt of respect, and a public meeting that would change the power structure of the Lynn family forever. Tonight, we were planning for the future. But somewhere else in the city, the future was being marked by another plan, one that required no courts, no attorneys. What none of us knew, as we sat in that small apartment mapping out tomorrow, was that Daphne Lynn, the woman I had not yet faced, was drafting a plan of her own. A plan that didn't involve lawyers or legal consequences. A plan built on the kind of specialists who understand that some problems require permanent solutions. On Wednesday morning, Amira Patel called in a rush. "Angela, we have a major problem. Daphne Lynn has hired Blackstone and Associates to challenge the acquisition. They're accusing you of using insider information and coercion to force the sale." I froze beside the kitchen counter. "Do they have any chance of winning?" "If they convince the court you received privileged information through your relationship with Sarah and Christopher, the deal could be voided. Worse, they could escalate it to securities fraud." I remembered the dinner party. Reginald bragging about 43 acquisitions, his methods of cutting unnecessary costs, the crushing debt, all openly right in front of me. "He said plenty," I exhaled. "Then we need to be extremely careful. From now on, do not contact the Lynn family. Every word can and will be used against you, and prepare for the preliminary hearing on Monday. 5 days." After hanging up, I sat still in the kitchen. I had wanted to teach them about consequences, and now I was fully inside the world where money and connections could rewrite reality. My phone rang again. Christopher. "Mom, I heard about the lawsuit. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but my attorney says I shouldn't talk right now." "You're my mom. We don't stop talking because of legal strategy. If they say you used family information, then we'll testify. Sarah and I will say Dad shared those things willingly." "And Sarah?" "She's being pressured to side with her mother, but she knows the truth. I believe Sarah is stronger than people think." That afternoon, I ignored Amira's warning and went to the cafe where Sarah had asked to meet. No designer clothes, no heavy makeup, just a young woman walking a tightrope between two worlds. "That night at the dinner party," Sarah asked, "did you already plan to buy the company?" I looked directly into her eyes. "Yes. The moment your father bragged about destroying family businesses, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Legally, that might be insider information," Sarah said slowly. "My attorney seems to think so too." Sarah sighed, then lowered her voice. "Mrs. Price, my mother doesn't just want the company back. She's pushing for charges, securities fraud, elder exploitation, conspiracy. She says you manipulated my father's mental state to force a below-value sale." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. The man who shattered entire retirement funds now trying to play the victim. "Sarah, when he signed the sale, was your father coerced?" "No, he was defeated but not coerced. You gave him two choices: cooperate or face legal consequences. That's negotiation, not manipulation. Would you testify to that?" She fell silent for a long time. "If I testify for you, my mother will disown me. No trust fund, no safety net. But if I testify for her, I'll help destroy the woman my fiancé loves and prove I value money over integrity." I took her hand. "I need truth to win, not pressure." Sarah squeezed my hand. On her face, for the first time, I saw genuine courage, choosing principle over comfort. "There's something my mother doesn't know," Sarah said quietly. "I recorded dinner last night. Dad admitted the pension fund issues and agreed to help rebuild the compensation trust. And I have hours of other recordings, business meetings, phone calls, even their tax avoidance strategies." I froze. "Do you understand how serious this is? It proves you reacted to my father's wrongdoing. Not that you engineered his downfall. I want to do the right thing, even if it terrifies me." We left the cafe. Sarah didn't know Daphne had hired a private investigator to tail her all week, and our entire meeting had already been photographed. A confession can save a deal. A photograph can burn everything down. When the truth is about to surface, power retaliates with tools that require no law at all. Sarah returned to Christopher, and I went back to Amira to prepare evidence and testimony. The legal battle had begun, but Daphne wasn't stopping at lawyers. She had just moved an off-the-books piece onto the board, and it was aimed directly at me. By Thursday morning, a new crisis hit, one so severe that Daphne's lawsuit suddenly looked gentle by comparison. I was reviewing files with Amira Patel when her assistant burst in, panicked. "Ms. Patel, you need to see the news now." The local broadcast opened, an exclusive investigation into alleged securities fraud surrounding the Lynn Global Advisors acquisition. Angela Price, the mysterious buyer, is accused of leveraging family connections for insider information. The screen showed the Lynn Global Advisors building, my building, alongside my portrait, with the word fraud blazing in red across the bottom. Amira muted the TV and turned to me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Genuine fear. "Angela, it's not just legal anymore. Once it hits the news cycle, public perception starts crushing everything. Judges don't want to look like they're protecting a criminal." How did they get the story so fast? Daphne has connections everywhere. Media, legal, political. She's no longer protecting the company. She's protecting the family name. My phone buzzed nonstop. Reporters, unknown numbers, people who suddenly wanted to be close. I shut it off and tried to listen to Amira outline our options, but the truth was, I was scared. The woman who had confidently bought Lynn Global Advisors just days ago seemed powerful and in control. The woman on television looked like a felon. "What do we do now?" I asked. "We speed everything up. The preliminary hearing is on Monday, but if the media frenzy worsens, their side may request an emergency injunction to freeze the deal." "You mean you could lose control of Lynn Global before you even get the chance to prove the transaction was legal? The restitution and recovery plan, it might evaporate if the sale is voided." I thought of Mrs. Henderson, 73 years old, stacking shelves after her pension evaporated, of Cedar Valley after the plant closed, of the hundreds of people waiting for justice, justice that might never come if I failed at the starting line. "Amira, we need to do something that won't look good publicly. Activate the restitution fund today." "Angela, that's skirting the line. Moving large sums right now could look like you're hiding assets before an investigation. Or like someone trying to do the right thing before legal tricks shut her down. That sounds reckless." "That's justice." Amira dove into the emergency transfer logistics. I drove to Christopher's apartment, maybe our last conversation before Daphne's legal machine crushed everything. Christopher and Sarah greeted me with coffee, wearing the strained optimism of people who'd just received bad news. They had seen the broadcast. Sarah's eyes were red, and Christopher looked like he'd aged 5 years since Monday's dinner. "Mom, "We need to talk about Sarah's recordings," Christopher began. I sat down. They sat side by side, a unified front. "What's in them?" I asked. Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady, despite how exhausted she looked. "I went through 6 months of recordings, family dinners, business meetings, phone calls with partners. What I have is evidence of a systematic pattern of financial crime over many years. Specifically? Pension fund embezzlement, tax evasion, bribery, fraudulent bankruptcies of acquired companies. My father didn't just dismantle businesses, he stole from them." Christopher opened his laptop and played a clip. Reginald's voice, mixed with clinking glasses and the smugness of a man who believed he was untouchable. "The best part of the Morrison Furniture deal is they never traced the pension fund. Their lawyers were still unraveling the subsidiary chain. By the time they got close, the money was offshore." "Morrison Furniture?" I asked. "A family business in Pennsylvania, 300 employees, most nearing retirement," Sarah whispered. "My father wiped $17 million from their pension fund, sent it through a Caribbean shell. One clip after another, each one a crime, a victim, a family swallowed whole by Reginald's greed." When we finished listening, I understood. My acquisition of Lynn Global wasn't just justified. It was necessary. "Sarah, do you understand what you're giving me?" I asked. "The truth, and evidence that every action you took was based on real wrongdoing. But you're also bringing down your own family." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then looked at Christopher before meeting my eyes again. "I grew up believing my father was a successful businessman. Now I know he's a criminal who destroyed hundreds of lives." "And your mother?" "She knew. She always knew. She just didn't care because the money was too good." Christopher took Sarah's hand. "Mom, we've made our decision. We're helping you take all this to the authorities, not just to keep control of Lynn Global, but to expose everything my father-in-law has done." "Christopher, that will tear Sarah's family apart." "Holding them accountable," Sarah corrected softly. "There's a difference. A single recording can shift the battlefield. A single injunction can freeze everything, and a mother must choose between what's right and what's safe, before someone else chooses for her, by erasing her entirely. While we were planning to submit evidence and launch the restitution fund, none of us knew Daphne had gone even further than lawyers and private investigators." At exactly 6 p.m., as we sat surrounded by audio files, Daphne called a man known for handling situations that can't be settled in court. "I need this woman gone," she said evenly. "Handle it however you want. Just eliminate Angela Price before she destroys my family." On the other end came the response, silent, professional, final. Friday morning exploded at exactly 7:23 a.m. when Amira Patel called, her voice tightened like a pulled wire. "Angela, you need to get to the hospital now." "Why? What happened?" "Someone tried to kill Sarah last night." Those words hit me like a physical punch. I grabbed whatever clothes I could reach, my hands trembling as my mind struggled to process. "Is she alive?" "Yes, but barely. This wasn't a random robbery. Someone broke in, staged it to look like theft. If Christopher hadn't come home early from his work trip..." I didn't let Amira finish. I bolted to the car. Police escorts wailed beside me. The early morning city split open under a kind of speed, born only when someone you love is fighting to breathe. The hallway outside the ICU was a battlefield of pain. Christopher paced like a cornered animal. His shirt still stained with the blood he'd carried Sarah and Amira, stood with 2 FBI agents, their presence alone proof that this had surpassed anything the local police could handle. "Mom!" Christopher's voice cracked when he saw me. I wrapped him in my arms, feeling the tremors of raw terror still shaking through him. "What are the doctors saying?" "Concussion, broken ribs, internal bleeding. They said if I'd come home 15 minutes later..." He couldn't continue. "Who did this?" Agent Martinez stepped forward, his gaze weighted like lead. "Mrs. Price, we need to talk about the Lynn family. the evidence you're holding, and why someone is willing to commit attempted murder to silence you. In a private conference room, Martinez opened a file. The pages inside made my acquisition battle look like a children's squabble. The FBI has been quietly tracking this for 18 months. Reginald and Daphne Lynn didn't just strangle businesses. They are a laundering node in a larger network. Drug trafficking organizations, human trafficking, political corruption. The stolen pension funds didn't disappear. They were cleaned through shell companies and funneled into criminal operations. The room spun around me. You're telling me my son married into that? I'm telling you your son's in-laws are connected to very dangerous people. When you bought Lynn Global Advisors, talked about restitution and federal investigation, you didn't just threaten their money. You threatened their freedom and potentially their lives. Martinez laid out another set of photos. Crime scenes, corpses, accidents that no longer looked accidental. In the past 5 years, 7 individuals who challenged the Lynn network died from accidents, car crashes, house fires, unexplained heart attacks that never received proper investigation. And Sarah? We do not believe Daphne ordered her killed. This was a message for you. Stop, return the company, forget what you've learned, or no one in your family is safe. That afternoon, while Sarah was in surgery, I sat with Christopher in the waiting room and made the hardest decision of my life. Christopher, if something happens to me, the restitution fund has already been maximized within legal limits. The rest is locked in an irrevocable trust for the victims' families. Mom, don't say that. Someone tried to kill your wife. This is not the moment to fantasize about safety. Then give the company back, Mom. Stop the restitution. We'll back out. Go somewhere safe. Wait until this blows over. I looked at my son and saw Michael in his eyes, that unbreakable moral spine stretched thin as a violin string. Do you remember what your father said about bullies? You can't beat them by running. Exactly. The Lynns destroyed lives for 40 years because no one strong enough ever stood in their way. If I retreat, Sarah's attack means nothing. Hundreds of families stay ruined, money stays stolen, crimes stay unpunished. And if you don't retreat, they might kill you. Maybe. But they might kill me even if I do retreat, just to send a message to anyone else who dares stand up. Christopher was silent for a long time. Then he lifted his head. Mom, there's something Sarah and I found before she was attacked. What is it? They're preparing to disappear. New identities, offshore accounts, a getaway route. They're ready to abandon Sarah to take the fall. I froze. They would abandon their own daughter? Sarah is adopted. Daphne told her years ago, if she ever became a liability, she'd be cut off. No love, no loyalty. In that moment, I finally understood my enemy. Not just criminals, but cruelty incarnate. Sarah had always been an entry on a ledger, a disposable asset in the Lynn dynasty, and they had made their final, fatal mistake. They underestimated a mother. 3 days later, once Sarah was recovering under 24/7 FBI protection, I met with Amira and Martinez to finalize the endgame. Sarah's recordings are enough to lock down charges of laundering, fraud, conspiracy, Martinez said, but we want the entire network, partners, shells, offshore accounts. What do you need to make that happen? We need Daphne to incriminate herself, on tape. Amira looked at me, fear sharpening her features. Angela, they want you wired, meeting Daphne directly. I know. She just ordered a hit on your daughter-in-law. She won't hesitate. I know. But Sarah nearly died because of me. Hundreds of families are waiting for justice. If there's a chance to end this, I'm taking it. The warehouse that night looked like the sort of place people don't walk away from darkness thick, overhead lights dripping cold illumination onto concrete floors. I stepped in because some conversations are meant only for two predators who finally recognize each other. Daphne stood beneath a lone beam of light, elegant as she had been the night we first met, except now the eyes carried no disguise. Angela, thank you for coming. Thank you for not sending another assassin. She smirked. Business? Nothing personal. I underestimated how sentimental you were about my useless adopted daughter. Sarah is worth more than your entire criminal empire. Sarah is a loss. She'll learn her lesson after this. I scanned the warehouse. Exits, blind corners, shadows that could hide more men. What do you want, Daphne? I want my life back. The company, the money, my freedom. In return, your family lives. Christopher keeps his law career. Sarah recovers. And you retire quietly on whatever's left after returning what you stole from me. The audacity was grotesque self-victimization, the trademark move of the vicious. Why would I believe you? Because the alternative is everyone you love ends up like Sarah, permanently this time. I understood then. This wasn't negotiation. It was confession before execution. So tell me something, I said. When you ordered the attack on Sarah, did you feel anything? Sarah isn't my child, just a failed project. And Christopher, my son? He'll mourn appropriately after your tragic accident, inherit what's left, and then learn to choose smarter alliances. I pulled out my phone and hit record, though I knew the true weapon wasn't the device. Tell me how your laundering system works. I'm genuinely curious. Daphne laughed, the sound of glass shattering. You think you're baiting me into a confession? Angela, you're not leaving this warehouse alive. I can say whatever I want. Then say it. And she did. For 20 straight minutes, she laid out every piece, the pension siphoning, the shell company labyrinth, the trafficking connections, the staged accidents, a 40-year criminal blueprint spoken with sickening pride. Finally, Daphne reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, cold handgun. Any last questions? Yes. What do you think the FBI will do when they hear this conversation? She froze. What recording? I held up my screen. The call had been streaming live to Amira's device, where federal agents had been listening to every word. In this conversation, you just confessed to laundering, murder, conspiracy, ordering the attack on Sarah, and threatening my son. Daphne's face drained. She kept the gun raised. No matter. You'll die, and the recording will be deemed fabricated. Maybe. But the agents surrounding this warehouse right now are not fabricated. At that exact moment, blinding floodlights exploded around us, turning night into day. FBI, drop the weapon! The next minutes were chaos, shouts, pounding footsteps, Daphne's desperate attempt to drag me as a human shield, before being subdued. All I could think of was Christopher and Sarah, safe in the hospital, finally free of the shadow that had stalked them for decades. One early morning phone call had exposed an empire. One recording in the dark had saved hundreds of families, and sometimes justice only begins when a mother refuses to bow. Today's story isn't just a corporate takeover. It is a journey toward justice and redemption. For those whose pensions were stolen, for the families crushed under greed, and for ourselves when we choose courage over fear. If you believe truth and courage can change destinies, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs a reason not to give up. Next week, we return with another story, one that proves light always finds a way.